Hello, everyone. Welcome to this discussion on non-military threats that are facing modern world and also Latvia. And this is an event that is organized by U.S. Embassy, and I'll be moderating discussion. My name is Iveta Kažoka. I'm usually better known in Latvia as interior policy expert, but this time, as we will be discussing issues related to social cohesion, disinformation, and probably other non-military threats, I'm thankful to U.S. Embassy who have asked me to moderate this discussion. We have three excellent speakers. Let me introduce you to all three of them, and let's start from Rita, who sits right next to me. Rita Rudusha, she is usually better known as a moderator of events such as this, but this time we will use her expertise because you know, as a moderator, you not always are allowed to tell your own opinion, and we are very interested in what you, Rita, are going to say about both media and disinformation threats facing this world. She is not only a journalist, she's also a media expert, and she has created her own documentary movies, and the one that are probably the most relevant to this topic is Homo Sovieticus, about the reasons why still so many people in Latvia, not only in Latvia, but other countries that were once subject to occupation by Soviet Union, held quite a restricted mindset, if I can try to very carefully summarize the main point of your movie that I saw and very much enjoyed. Christopher Robinson, or as he allowed everyone to call him just Chris, just Chris, is U.S. ambassador in Latvia, a new one. How long have you been here, Chris?
4 months.
Just 4 months. So, dear audience, please let him give good impression about Latvia. So, when you are coming up with your questions, just keep in mind that we still want to. I'm joking, of course. This discussion is also about telling your point of view very honestly, and you will have, I think, several opportunities to do that as an audience during this discussion. And Thomas Pildegovich, who is best known to Instagram crowd in Latvia as the person who has probably made Instagram a very educative and serious business for Latvian public, because he has been extremely crucial to all of us in learning about what Russia is doing in Ukraine, the military and non-military aspects of it. And I was really surprised in the very beginning when Thomas gained this extreme popularity on Instagram about the extent to which you can get people interested in those quite complicated topics if you are using means of communication and expressions that resonate with wider public. But Thomas is, of course, not only an Instagram star, but he's primarily here as a senior expert on strategic communication. He works in a NATO Stratcom Center, which is based in Latvia, as you know, and he's also an extremely valuable resource to our discussion. But before we are going to try to ask our panelists, participants about non-military threats facing today's world and also Latvia, this is something that I would like to address to you, dear audience. So, those of you who have mobile phones, and I'm almost certain that 95% of you do have mobile phones, please point your cameras to this QR code. And those of you who are watching us currently online, please go to slido.com and enter keyword drošība there. And what you will be asked to do is the following. Let me try to switch on that program so that all of you see what we are doing there. Okay, I think it works. Okay, it's not so easy. Okay, so there you will see 10 different security risks that have been partially generated by artificial intelligence and partially by me in cooperation with US Embassy on what are those risks facing concretely Latvia. And you should choose just one so that we can understand what in the minds of the audience that are gathered here are like the most important non-security threats, and then I will ask our panelists to comment on those results as they appear here. But before we do that, to give you more time to do your voting, I asked the same question to artificial intelligence, Bing chat, where this artificial intelligence tool, GPT-4, has access to online information about the most important non-military security risks facing not Latvia, but rather the whole world. And what it produced was a bit surprising to me, and it does not reflect at all what you are seeing right now in your screen relating to security threats facing Latvia, namely number 3 security threats that are of non-military nature. According to artificial intelligence, is first of all climate change, secondly infectious diseases such as COVID, number 3 irregular migration, and emerging technologies, and then there is disinformation. So that's the opinion of artificial intelligence. We can do whatever we want with it, maybe disregard it, maybe wonder about its such results. But right now, I think we are more or less clear about what the audience here believes are the most important non-military security risks facing Latvia. And let me tell you what are first top three. So number 1 would be societal polarization. Number 2 would be economic challenges. Number 3 would be, okay, either Russia's influence or disinformation. They are quite close. I would like to ask you to raise hands, those of you in the audience, if there are any, because there are also people who are watching online who are voting, who have picked societal polarization as number 1 non-military security risk facing Latvia. Is there anyone who has picked that choice? 1, 2, okay, I see several. Is there somebody of you who would like to explain what you mean by that? Okay, I saw some raised hands, but I'm not sure whether they were raised to attract more people in or whether they were the people who were choosing this sort of an answer. Is there anyone who would say that societal polarization is number 1 non-military security threat facing Latvia currently in the audience? No. Okay, those were only online voters who thought like that. Okay, who chose economic challenges? Okay, and who chose Russia's influence and disinformation? Okay, I would like to ask some of you to reflect very briefly, like in 2 sentences maximum. Why did you choose this sort of an option? Let's pass the microphone from you to people who were raising hands there. But no, right now, if you could explain your answer.
So I voted for Russia's influence.
Why?
Because it's a common threat through years in Latvia, so I don't see how anything else can be more threatful to Latvia than Russia's influence.
Okay, so that was your choice. Maybe if you could pass the microphone there. Who was raising the hand? No? No one is brave enough. Okay, let's give him the microphone, or you can just throw it. It's a catch box. Okay, there's probably some sound problem. Speak directly into this microphone. No. Okay, let's use this microphone.
Well, I think that economic challenges usually reflect the situation more generally in society, and it impacts what people think. and how they act in both elections and generally in society. So, you know, if they're doing quite not well, then they are more paranoid, more afraid, and etc. And that just fuels more problems in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there anyone else brave enough to say what do you think are the most important, or what is one most important challenge, non-security risk facing Latvia currently? No. Okay, so let's go back to our panelists, and let me remind you what are the four major challenges as identified by our audience, both online, those watching online and also here in Lampa. So societal polarization, we didn't really hear explanations why it might be a problem, but maybe you have some guesses on the reasons for this. Then number two would be economic challenges, and then Russia's influence and disinformation. To what extent do you think that our audience has done a good job in explaining the most important challenges facing Latvia from your point of view? Rita, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm not here to give grades to our audience. I think it's very good that you voted. Let's first note that civic participation is very important as a kind of Okay, we can speak very loudly, but that doesn't help the
live stream. No, yeah.
Now it's working? Okay. We are not being silenced. That's also very good. In addition to having a very civically engaged audience. So I think the issues identified here are actually interlinked. If there is a polarization, it falls onto a fertile ground if there are economic challenges and social inequality. Likewise, Russia's influence, of course, goes through disinformation, which again falls onto a fertile ground if you have economic challenges, polarization, and social inequality. And I assume we will be getting more into it as we speak in this discussion.
What would you have voted for? If you needed to vote on Slido, which would you pick? Societal polarization as well, or something else?
I think I would have picked, if I had to pick one, which is hard, because they are interlinked. Yeah. It would be hard for me to decide between Russian influence and societal polarization. But again, they are connected for me.
Thank you. Okay, so you are a newcomer to Latvia, so you have
Absolutely.
like fresh perspective.
So, sir, I'm going to take your answer and turn it back to both of these, because I think Russia is the threat, but it poses the threat where we don't have societal cohesion. Let me turn that around instead of societal polarization, as opposed to societal cohesion. We may disagree on issues, but we agree to use the democratic process, freedom of speech, to resolve those. And what have we seen in US elections, or in Latvia, in Moldova, where Russia has tried to intervene and play on those societal tensions that are trying to be resolved through a democratic process? We've seen Russia try to play on those. Same thing is true, and every Latvian in this audience has experienced that over the last year. On the economic side, 20% inflation and the rise of energy prices. We see how Russia uses economics as a weapon to wield influence, or corruption, which I think is just part of an economic challenge. It uses corruption to undermine our societies. So I think, as Rita already said, they're so interrelated, but it's how Russia uses these to carry out and pose a threat to the values and the systems that we're all here today celebrating. So if I have to put a priority, as a government person, it is very hard from a US perspective to address the social cohesion. But what we do here today helps address that. From a government perspective, really going at developing economic challenges, energy independence, the green transition, and combating corruption, all the things that Latvia is doing so successfully right now, I think those are really where we need to put a lot of attention in the year ahead. So that's what I would pick.
Okay, so our audience did quite well with the stars. Okay, thank you, Chris. Now, Thomas, do you also believe that our audience did quite well?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's a true pleasure to be in such illustrious company and with such a well-read, well-educated audience. I mean, I have nothing to nitpick. I think you're not wrong. Of course, our conversation today is focused on non-military threats, but I think it's important for us to first start at the backdrop against which this conversation is taking place, which is the fact that the presence of a military threat has served as a wake-up call. It has necessitated discussions on our capacity to deter, resist, and overcome all sorts of different crises. So seeing the way Ukraine has managed to withstand Russian aggression, I think it's a very fair question for us to ask, are we in the position to do the same? Are we equipped to do the same? And I hate to be very kind of philosophical right at the outset, but I think this conversation leads me to think in general about the kind of the social contract upon which our society in Latvia is based. The contract between the individual and the state. And I would say that since the restoration of independence, the social contract we've had in Latvia is one with very low degree of buy-in, one that requires very little investment from us and from the state. So from the state side, it hasn't really asked much of its citizens. It hasn't, required citizens to be, parts of some sort of organizations. The tax burden hasn't been too high. We have not had mandatory conscription. The state does not ask much. And from the individual side, engagement or any kind of dealing with state institutions, it's often seen as a burden, right? So going to vote, a significant segment of our society does not participate in elections. Paying taxes, we do have a very sizable shadow economy. And now, with Latvia reintroducing conscription, this is something I've also been working on to kind of motivate young people to participate, to undergo reserve training. We see that people are not necessarily so keen to get involved, to kind of pay their due to the state. This sort of argument does not resonate with our society on a widespread scale. So I think that, as I said, this is an important wake-up call where we need to reflect about the factors that make up our whole of society so-called resilience, and all of these challenges really feed into this question of our society's resilience as a whole. So I think you're not wrong. I agree that these threats are largely interlocking, but I do think we need to ask kind of, can we go on as before, or do we need to redefine or add something new to the social contract of our state if we are to be secure in navigating these challenges?
Thank you, Thomas. Before I allow Rita to comment probably on the social contract aspect of it, I would like to ask you the same question that you probably addressed to everyone here. So, is it enough, or is there something that we should do as a society, as Latvia, in order to add to our social contract, where you see we are lacking at the moment?
I think the most glaring vulnerability begins with our education system. Mm-hmm. I think it needs a wholesale reform. It needs an injection of a heavy dose of imagination, a heavy dose of transfer of best practices from, for instance, our newest ally, Finland. I think this kind of civic, patriotic commitment is something that needs to be embedded in our education curricula from early on, along with other skills that I think are thus far neglected, critical thinking, media literacy. These sorts of programs need to be firm. They don't need to be some, extra seminar. No, they need to be embedded in our education system, because our society's ability to, be resilient to disinformation, let's say, or polarization, depends on us equipping our citizens with these skills from a very young age.
Thank you, Thomas. Rita, would you agree that there is something missing in our social contracts that we are having currently in Latvia?
It just has very low expectations on both sides and low obligations, really. You know, we will do the minimum, the bare minimum, we as a state, and in return, the citizens will also do a bare minimum. So basically, leave us alone. We'll pay taxes, maybe, not necessarily. We'll do our job, maybe, not always. So it's kind of a low expectation, low obligations on both sides. And I think the litmus test for that societal, the social contract was the response to COVID and the anti-vax movement. How dare you expect anything of us? How dare you, the state, expect us to do something just out of solidarity for other citizens? That was kind of the first test that really showed it. And another litmus test, I would say, was the attitude towards the idea of the service, the military service. That was another one. How dare you expect that from me? And that ties to what you mentioned, that I was part of the film crew behind documentary Homo Sovieticus. I do think it is partly tied to the remnants of Soviet thinking, where the state was something alien and separate from me. We see that in Latvia we have very low, if compared to, say, Northern Europe, we have very low percentage of people who participate on a daily basis as citizens. That's why I praised our audience who are ready to participate and vote. Well, we can go, and we have low, as you know, participation numbers of voting turnout also. But on a daily basis, unless it's a choir singing, we don't actually participate in NGO, in any kind of civic movement. And that is the weakness. That also shows what we see as social contract. We don't want to invest into it.
But maybe, thank you, Rita, to make this discussion even more interesting. I would go for reality check to Chris. As a US ambassador, you will serve as a reality check to understand whether we are really unique in the sense that there is something lacking in Latvian social contract, in the sense of that Thomas and Rita explained, namely people really do not like state interfering with their business. Doesn't really characterize also of another country that you probably know.
Maybe this is why the United States and Latvia are such good friends and partners, because we have very much of the same society attitudes and challenges in the United States. But I think, if anything, the war in Ukraine should be a wake-up call, and to look at things across our society and look at them as a national security priority, not in a negative way, but in a positive way, that it is important to our future that we invest in these, in education, in a civic culture, in addressing why are people not motivated to want to have military service. As I see a young audience, and I've seen the polls where young Latvians look to see their future outside of Latvia. As the US ambassador, what is it that young Latvians want to see, that they see their future in Latvia? A secure, prosperous Latvia. How do we address these issues that Latvians feel confident that their future is secure and prosperous here? That's something I'm interested in as the US ambassador to partner with. But the war in Ukraine really should be a wake-up. Moscow has tried to bring down the values and the culture that we all live and benefit from. So how do we go back and look at that in education, in healthcare, all these things? How do we go back and look at some of these as a national reinvestment priority so that we have a stronger society, a more cohesive society, and a stronger economy that delivers benefits for our people? When we do those, then no matter what Moscow throws at us, they will not be successful.
Okay, thank you so much. Just a question addressed to you, but also and partly Thomas and Rita. It depends on whether you also want to jump in. You know, in Latvia, we've been trying to think about non-military threats already for maybe 3 to 5 years, where this new perspective was produced by our Ministry of Defense, namely this idea that we should think about state security in a comprehensive manner. So not only military risks, but also other security risks, among which you see Russia's influence, societal polarization, and everything else that our very smart audience has prioritized in their responses. But currently, we are still looking for a good way on how to work on these kinds of topics in this interconnected manner, so that when we are thinking about security of Latvia or defense of Latvia, we are not only prioritizing our military, but also other risks. You have a very extensive diplomatic experience, and maybe you know some example or at least some direction in which we can move in order for this to be feasible. Because until now, there are maybe some concepts, but not much more than that. So what would your advice be so that we can focus not only on military issues, but also see the rest of those risks as part of our security?
Okay, so I'm new, and I've only been here 4 months. But I'm very much a believer in Latvia. Who would have thought Latvia could disconnect from Russian power and energy and dependence on oil and the corrupt network that it brought so quickly and so successfully, and move into a modern energy environment so successfully, so quickly? Nobody. But Latvia did it in such a short period of time. And I know there's been a cost. Nothing that we do to protect our security is without cost. But Latvia did it and is now well positioned for a green energy future by the steps that have been made. And that is a whole of government effort to bring that around successfully. Latvia has a great model of doing regional exercises where you bring the military and municipal government together. And that is a great example also. And what we need to try to do is, how do we bring that, even think more comprehensively? As an outsider, what would Latvia be most vulnerable to? Would be some sort of hybrid effort by Moscow, playing on these challenges that we see here. So how do we bring education ministry? How do you bring transport ministry together as part of these discussions, among others, so that we're prepared together to approach that? I think that's Latvia's advantage. Because of your size, your comprehensiveness, you can do this. We learned the hard way with 9/11 when we had government agencies that did not cooperate and coordinate together. It made us vulnerable. Cohesion and having a whole of government and whole of society approach to counter this. And I really believe Latvia can do that. And that is the way forward to address these, as the panelists have already said, comprehensively.
But it's not just the government, the whole government, it's, all of society, and also it's about relationships, a partnership. If the government sees civil society as a partner and contributor, that already contributes to resilience, societal resilience. If the government sees the media not as an adversary, but also as an essential part of a functioning, vibrant, democratic society, that also helps. Thomas mentioned media literacy that needs to be integrated in, and I fully agree, I couldn't agree more, that it needs to be fully integrated in the education system. We could start from our politicians. They are not going back to school, but I think one of the issues we have here is the media literacy levels of decision makers. So they need to see, we need to see collectively partnerships valuable between the government and NGOs. We need to see that independent and strong media need to be part, again, of this overall picture. If we are holding discussion just a few days ago with a question mark, does Latvia need strong public media? Really? Is that a question? So that needs to be seen as a value and a source of strength.
Okay, thank you. One of the points that Chris raised, I started to think about the perception of risks, how they change over the years. Because if we had asked this kind of question that we asked via Slido 10 years ago, I'm almost sure that the number one response about non-security threats facing Latvia would be depopulation. You mentioned that basically it's very important that people want to live in Latvia and not go outside just because they don't feel welcome here or they cannot really economically survive here. Currently, I would just ask the audience to raise your hands. To what extent, please raise your hands, those of you who believe that depopulation is still one of the threats facing Latvia currently. There are quite a few, but less than half, which is interesting because, as I said, like 5 and 10 years ago, it was one of those major topics. Probably it's linked in some manner to economic challenges, but nevertheless, we can see that well, some risks tend to get worse over time, and some improve, which is a good proof of the concept that you also mentioned relating to energy dependence. That with right policies, basically things can change quite a lot. But right now, I would like to focus on on disinformation, which is one of those major risks that is facing Latvia, especially if we are thinking about it in context of emerging technologies. And before this discussion here in the space, there was a discussion on freedom of speech, and also other discussions on what can we predict about the future. And my question would primarily be to Thomas and also to Rita, but also Chris, feel free to jump in if you wish. To what extent do you feel that disinformation as a threat is going to get worse rather than improve over the coming years? Because if population decline was something that we are not really prioritizing as much as the risk, and that's a positive trend, can we expect the same from disinformation, or you can see that the opposite probably is more likely?
I think disinformation is going to get worse if we do not make a series of investments, a series of pressing investments. I think there's now a growing awareness that this kind of traditional orthodox approach to combating disinformation based on, fact-checking, based on these sort of technical fixes, like bans, there's more and more credible research suggesting that the effectiveness of these approaches is questionable. So to put it in simple terms, there's credible research showing that once a person has been kind of exposed to disinformation, it's actually very difficult to get this person to kind of change their mind, even once presented with the correct facts. So fact-checking is not only slow, reactive, really expensive, but it's also questionable in efficacy. So why the same applies with bans. For instance, Latvia, I believe, made the belated but still very necessary decision to ban the retranslation of Russian state-promoted television channels. Very good decision in principle, but it's very easy to ban something, and it's much more difficult to offer something quality in its place. Because we need to be realistic, right? These Russian state TV channels were one of the primary sources of information for a sizable segment of our society. But once access to these channels has been restricted, it's not as if all of these people are now reading Meduza and BBC Russia and are now subscribing to the Wall Street Journal and doing all of these things. No, they're either using ways to circumvent these bans and still consume the same content, or they're sitting in sort of shady Telegram groups or closed messaging boards and things like that. So the Latvian government needs, in my view, to be realistic and to make necessary investments to offer something quality in its place. And I don't think we need to, look somewhere on the other side of the globe for best practices. We need to look a bit north and see, how Estonia is going about it.
Yeah.
I would agree that it will grow if we do nothing. And I will speak now from the perspective of the media and journalists. One of the big successes of Russian propaganda and years of consuming Russian state channels is the distrust of media in society. We see, it is well researched, that the trust in media is steadily falling, and that erosion is partly, if not largely, due to the content that's been coming from these Kremlin-controlled channels. And there is a lot of homework to do for us as journalists in regaining that trust. We have to work harder. We have to be more human-centered. We also have to be, in a way, also media literacy advocates, not by way of doing seminars for small groups of people, no, by way of explaining how journalists do their job, by way of explaining how public interest content is being produced and what does public interest actually mean and how much work goes into it. So there's a lot of work for us, but of course in general I totally agree with Thomas. There needs to be investment into alternatives to Russian channels and public interest content that is also locally relevant. You don't need millions for that. You just need content where people who are here see themselves and see the issues that are close to them reflected.
Thank you. A question to you and also to Thomas about what you just said about investment in quality media. Would it mean also quality media in Russian language? Because as you well know, it's quite controversial currently in Latvia. It's under political debate. But as people who know very well both the media landscape in Latvia and also the societal structure and attitudes, would you advise our government to go in this direction to strengthen public media in the Russian language?
Well, as far as I am aware, nobody has cancelled yet the obligation of public media to serve minority audiences. So we are still, public media are obliged to serve minority audiences. If minority audience content is no longer supported, then the next question is how do public media serve minority audiences? So this is the big question because, okay, if you reduce that content production in, say, the Russian language, and by the way, it's not just the Russian language that public media produce in. So how do you serve that audience? How do you make sure that they are in this conversation, in that public debate space that is partly also created by public media? So that there needs to be then an alternative. I haven't seen it.
Okay, thank you, Thomas.
Well, I think in the long term, the positions of the Latvian language should be strengthened, including through facilitating this transition to Latvian-only schooling and so forth. But in the immediate term, it would be extremely dangerous to leave any kind of coverage or discussions, let's say, for instance, of the war in Ukraine, to Russian propaganda narratives. It would be extremely hypocritical to, on one hand, completely curtail or limit any kind of Russian language public broadcasting, and then have hand-wringing over, oh, how is it possible that people in our country have different interpretations of, I don't know, of the 9th of May, or different interpretations of what's happening in Ukraine, or, you know, the nature of the Russian regime. So in the immediate term, I am certainly against any kind of attempt to, I don't know, I've heard the calls of some politicians to strip away the budget of Latvian Radio 4, or to limit, to kind of take away funding from the public broadcaster communicating in minority language. But long-term, the Latvian language position should be strengthened.
And this is also a generational issue. If this happens now in short term, that there is a demographic group that will have basically no access to local content. And with the younger people, it is not, they are multilingual and it's much less of an issue. But we cannot just ignore that there is a 50+ part of the minority audience that will then not be served. But in the long term, but we are not talking about the immediate challenges. So the immediate challenges, to address immediate challenges, you have to engage also in minority languages.
Thank you, Rita and Thomas. I'll just ask the question to Chris, more broad one, but also relating to disinformation. So what your estimation is on the best way to fight disinformation? Would it be, as Thomas and Rita are suggesting, investment in quality media, or you would still maybe argue with maybe there is some value in fact-checking and prohibitions, etc.? In your experience, what would be the best way?
So look, with disinformation, I think that's going to constantly be there, whether it's from Russia or China or some other adversary. We are always going to be facing a war on truth. And so one of the things that, from the United States perspective, that we can counter that is with actually telling the truth, telling our story. The more active, the more engaged we as governments can be, and media holding government to account, that helps combat the truth, but the disinformation. But that does come back to a very modern challenge that's true in Latvia and the United States. We consume media in a very narrow set. If you're conservative, you tend to consume conservative media, whether online or in print or in social media. If you're more of a left orientation, you would tend to consume light media. And that can make us very vulnerable. And so I do think that goes back to the importance of media literacy and how we started our conversation. The investment in education is a great opportunity to develop a culture of media literacy that can then serve frankly, as a national security issue. It is both proactive in communicating and defensive in building an aware culture that can help discern and combat disinformation over time.
Okay, so I think we are done with topic relating to disinformation, at least partly because all those topics, as all of you mentioned, are interlinked. And I would still want to dwell on this topic relating to societal polarization, because this has not really been explained by our audience, why so many selected this, but I guess the reasons are kind of obvious when we look at opinion surveys and results of elections. Namely, Latvian speakers tend to vote one way and Russian speakers tend to vote another way, even though there are nuances also according to how, depending on how wealthy a person is, the voting choice is very different, and perception about what's happening in Latvia is quite different. I would like to ask you, the audience, again with raising your hands method, about whether you believe the societal polarization during, let's say, last 2 years has grown better, gone worse, or stayed the same. Please raise your hands, those of you who are saying that things are improving with societal polarization currently in Latvia compared to how it was. Okay, one brave person. Okay. What about those who believe that things are getting worse? Okay, and how many would say that, well, more or less the same, nothing is changing that much? Okay, also very few hands, and the rest probably are still thinking about this problem. Can I ask you, sir, to tell very briefly, why do you believe that things are improving?
I think that things are improving because I have a lot of Russian friends, Russian-speaking friends. After war in Ukraine started, a lot of those Russian friends turned to Latvian side. They started believing what Latvians were saying a long time ago, because before war in Ukraine, they were always convinced that no, Russia will never do that, that's bullshit, it's all lies. Now they are believing that it is true, so they are turning to
Okay, it's probably our catch box works now. Those of you who please raise once again, at least some of you hands who said that things are getting worse relating to societal polarization. Okay, I will ask both of you to explain.
Yeah, so why I think it's getting worse is that, well, problem with polarization from national side is getting better, as I agree. But in terms of economics and all this anti-vax things and everything, that didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago. So it's all new, all globalized, this left and right split is happening also here, which didn't exist before. So that's worrying.
Okay, thank you. Who was it? Who was up?
I think the problem is not only about this national minority thing, it just comes more from the social networking, because the algorithms are giving this information that we are looking for and that we kind of positively react to. And now we're looking for people who are thinking the same that we are thinking. It has been also in the past, but now with the algorithms and social networking, it's deeper, and it's again with the anti-vax things during the COVID times, the national minorities and geopolitical situations. So yeah, just looking for information that we like, and if there's different information or different opinions, we're kind of trying to reject it.
Does anyone else have something they think needs to be said about this topic? If not, let's go. Okay. You will need to catch it. Sorry. Okay. Good catch.
Is it work? Yeah. I think polarization is a word that is more often associated with the United States on the political front. So, I mean, it's important to know what we're talking about when we talk about polarization. Is it political? Is it sort of social issues such as, you know, the rights of minorities, sexual minorities, and not just ethnic minorities? So, you know, polarization probably, I think it depends on how you define it.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, we barely missed the camera. But let me go back to our panelists. Thomas, let's start with you. How would you have responded to this question in context of Latvia? In your case, in context of Latvia, is societal polarization something that's getting better or worse?
You know, I actually wanted, I think, in the beginning to maybe echo a bit what this brave gentleman in the front said, because there is you know, surveys, polling showing that Latvia is one of the countries that actually has not succumbed to war fatigue, despite significant social pressures, cost of living crisis, inflation, rising utility bills, energy prices. Despite this, support for Ukraine's fight for its independence and security has grown across Latvian society compared to March 2022. And it's actually grown among both ethnic Latvians and ethnic Russians in Latvia. Why I think the second part of that is particularly important is I think that this face of this common threat, this external threat, and the way Russia has waged this war, the way the Russian military has conducted its operations, these atrocities, brutality, mass rape, and so on, it has really squandered Russia a lot of its historical prestige that it has abroad. So these narratives, these historical narratives that, you know, glorify the Red Army, glorify the Soviet military accomplishments, we see that the power of these narratives has lost traction. And I think that one of the most important case studies of this is the tearing down of the so-called monument to the liberators of Riga, right? Before such a step would be unimaginable, it would be seen as something that will really, you know, kind of tear the fabric of society, and it would be met with widespread rioting or maybe even violence and so on. And here it was actually done in a quite calm way. It was surprising the lack of the backlash. And I think that my interpretation of this would be that for a significant part of the ethnic Russian community, association with these Soviet military symbols, it no longer is so appealing. And just final thought. So why I say all of this, I think that in a way I would like to echo the gentleman's thesis that the presence of an external threat has actually helped heal some of the cleavages. I remember in year one, semester one of university, kind of very basic international relations theory, and I remember reading this article that basically argues that the reason why we have so much interstate conflict and why international cooperation is so fractured or so limited is the presence of an overwhelming external threat, basically arguing that what we would need for a truly functional, let's say, United Nations or something like this, we would need basically aliens to come and threaten our planet. And under such conditions, we would do a better job. So we don't quite have aliens, but we do have, you know, a genocidal empire on our borders. And I think, so that has caused some positive traction.
Yeah. Rita, before I allow you to also have your take on it, just a follow-up question to you, Thomas. So your general opinion seems to be quite optimistic. So I would like to learn, what would your take be on the results of those opinion surveys that show quite a lot of resentment among Russian-speaking population? Could it be the case that yes, there are no large-scale protests against demolishing those Soviet-era monuments, but there is some resentment and confusion simmering underneath that we are maybe, as a society, we haven't really processed yet?
I mean, certainly. There is a significant degree of kind of disenfranchisement, the degree to which individuals feel like they belong. And again, as the Ambassador Leah just very accurately pointed out, it's kind of reductionist to only talk about polarization along these geopolitical issues, right? There are so many people that feel economically left behind, that feel that they do not have adequate access to healthcare, or people in the regions, in the rural regions, feel that, you know, the state neglects their development, and so on. So I completely do not exclude that there is a lot of discontent bubbling, simmering.
Yeah, discontent and resentment actually not just among the Russian-speaking population, that is also present in Latvian-speaking population. But I would agree with those who say that it's getting worse, and not just because of algorithms that feed on strong emotions, and that has been research, so well researched, so many papers published about it, so I will not repeat all that. But I would add, though, that what is I think, new in Latvian politics is that the resentment is being capitalized on. So there are political forces that build their campaigns on resentment, that build entire campaign on anti-vaxxer movement. And that is new. So even though a phenomenon of capitalizing on resentment is not new, it hadn't been used in Latvia to the same extent before as it is now. And we even borrow from the States, I'm sorry, some from Trump campaign, you know, the mainstream media is the enemy, and so on. So this... Yeah, yes, law and order and all that. So, so we have learned now to turn resentment into political points.
Oh, then again, a fresh perspective.
Back to us. So, I think let me approach it from the U.S. perspective. I think all of our faults and shortcomings I've been very transparent for everybody to see, and it amazes me as I engage Latvian audiences how closely Latvian audiences follow American politics. But if you were to read our national security strategy, we actually acknowledge these shortcomings, but yet we believe in investing in our democratic process and our institutions all the more. Going back to how we started our conversation, we need to reinvest in ourselves and in our society and above all our institutions so that we can address some of those shortcomings and so that we can address what are the roots of the political polarization, legitimate issues on how does Latvia, how does the United States move forward to meet these challenges. There are real debates to be had that, as I watch as an outsider for Latvia, they are important discussions to have, but we should strengthen the democratic process as we do that. That will make us stronger, that will lead to more social cohesion, and that will also make us less vulnerable to the Russian pressure to try to interfere and tip those discussions to its own advantage.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador. I wanted now shift gears a bit. We are approaching the final part of our discussion, like last 6 minutes. And until now, we've only talked about Latvia. So my last question would be more global. And I'm wondering about this disconnect that the audience here, when they responded to questions about non-military security risks facing Latvia, those answers were so very different than when thinking about our world as such, the globe. And when I looked at this response given by artificial intelligence, the top 5 priority list was nothing in common with security risks we are thinking about primarily when we are thinking about Latvia. Let me once again name those non-military security risks produced by artificial intelligence, like analysis: climate change, infectious diseases, irregular migration, food shortages, transnational crime, and number 6 was resource scarcity. And then it was disinformation, emerging tech, etc. So could it be the case that in Latvia, when we are thinking about non-military security risks, we are still thinking too narrowly? That when facing the 5, 10, 15, 50-year future, we should also take a more global perspective and think about threats such as climate change, such as infectious diseases, also as security risks that not only the world as such has to face, but also we as a country.
Are you sure that Chat GPT didn't fall prey to Russian propaganda when it was?
It's possible. It's possible.
feeding off of everything that is floating out there on the internet. Okay, that's a joke. I think we are not. Yes and no, because on the one hand, certainly in terms of climate change and thinking about green energy, which is, I'm saying, it's not my area of expertise, the conversation about green energy has been sped up and intensified, certainly because of the war in Ukraine, because of us weaning off the fossil fuels coming from Russia. So at least in that respect, I think we are joining more the global conversation. But we only have 3 minutes, so let my colleagues.
I'll be very quick. Russia has weaponized each one of those that you raised. They weaponized migration on Latvia's own border or with the Syria crisis. They've weaponized climate change to resist global norms and developing new technologies. They've weaponized cyber and artificial intelligence. And so it goes back to what President Biden has spoken of many times, of democracy versus autocracy, and that the democratic nations of the world need to continue to work together, both internally, as we've started talking about, to build up our approach, and then together to defend the rules-based system that protects and advances all of these issues. But again, we see how our adversary takes those. It goes back to the need to invest in addressing each of those root challenges.
So your core recipe would be to strengthen the rules-based system, global rules-based system. Okay, thank you.
I mean, I have to say, I do find it shocking. You know, Lampa, it's a notorious gathering for liberals and for young people. And the fact that nobody would say climate change among this list, I find it shocking. But I do think it's also indicative of the times we live in and of the really extraordinary destruction that Russia has waged. Of course, that has become something that sort of consumes our thinking. Nevertheless, I do think it's important for us not to kind of resort back to our old ways of being this kind of one-issue country. You know, this is a very nasty label that some countries in the West would sometimes paint the Baltics with, like, you know, these guys are seeped in their historical trauma. They're unable to, they participate in, European Council meetings and different types of EU working groups, but they basically are taking a nap when the conversation concerns Latin America or Africa or Southeast Asia. And then when Russia comes up, oh, we're foaming at the mouth. We have so much to say. We're ready to teach the Westerners about their, naivete. So this very much comes to bubble when we now, are looking to build a global coalition to isolate and sanction Putin. And we try to, speak to Brazil, countries in Central America. We speak to Africa saying, how can you not support us on this? This is a grave violation of international law. This is horrific. And they say, gone are the times when you could have this hypocritical setup where Europe's problems are the world's problems, but world's problems are not Europe's problems. So, that's why it's important for us to have something to offer, to have something to contribute on all of these pressing global issues, even if they're not maybe our utmost priority at this moment.
Okay, so one of the key lessons from this discussion is that maybe in maybe 5 years' time in Lampa, we should have a discussion specifically about the non-military security risks facing the world and agree that those problems that are facing Latvia very directly and where we all feel extremely enthusiastic about, that we will leave them aside in order to be able to also somehow resonate with what other world's regions are thinking and perceiving as important issues. You want
Here, just that.
Okay, yeah, but it does not really make those issues that were identified by this audience and by our excellent experts here in this panel any less pressing, because we are living in those conditions as we do, with Russia having invaded Ukraine. So it's obvious that at the forefront of our attention are those issues that are linked with this very real threat that is of military nature. But then a very big thank you to U.S. Embassy, who's also has invited us and given us this opportunity to think more broadly about other non-military risks that are very much linked to Russia that are also facing Latvia. So please join me in thanking our excellent panelists, Thomas, Chris, and Rita. And thank you And thank you, dear audience, as well, for voting in Slido and also commenting and asking questions. Thank you.
Please join us at the U.S. tent. We'll be there to answer the questions you were too polite to ask in front of everybody else.
And thank you for the excellent moderation. Thank you.
Yes.